If the test is rolling back 40 years of neoliberalism, then you've got to do something about the yawning gap between the rich and the poor. But if you don't do that, then you are going to be throwing people into the hands of reform.
Do you think he will be a radical prime minister, or do you think he will tend to move back to kind of more traditional norms?
I think it's going to be really difficult for him not to be radical, given what he said about what he's intending to do and the change that he wants to bring about.
I think there's an appetite, certainly on the economy, to do something pretty radical. Since 2008 and the economic crash, we've had stagnant wages, stagnant living standards, and people feel in large parts of the country completely screwed.
It's not all a game in which you turn a dial here and try and get elected. It's about, for me, trust in politics.
This is a moment to see if politics and the culture of politics and the relations of politics can be recast.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Anushka Asthana. Andy Burnham is officially the Prime Minister, saying this moment will be a circuit breaker for Britain, with the biggest changes in 40 years, promising a new political model, decentralising power, reindustrialisation and attacking privatisation. His number one instruction, he said, would be to end rough sleeping. But first, he's promising us some breathing space with a funded, he says, cost of living policy coming tomorrow. So what kind of Prime Minister will he actually be? Will his first appointments reveal a very different political project, or is this more evolution than revolution? And can he rebuild trust in politics when confidence in politicians is so low? Joining me to discuss this is Neal Lawson, an ally of Andy Burnham and the co-founder of the influential left-wing Compass, strategist Peter Hyman, who was at the heart of Downing Street during the Blair years and also an advisor to Keir Starmer in opposition, and the political editor at the iPaper, Caroline Wheeler. So thank you all for joining us. It's all very live at the moment. Caroline, I bumped into you earlier on Downing Street. You and I have stood on that street many, many times, and we've watched this merry-go-round, if you like, particularly sped up over the last few years. And I've seen some pretty good speeches from new prime ministers. What did you make of the Andy Burnham speech? What does it tell us about what type of prime minister he's going to be?
Well, he clearly wants to be very authentic. I think the fact that there was no lectern there, which many people have mentioned, was kind of symbolic of his desire to do things differently. He's already talked about in his speech to the TUC on Friday about having his own style. And that was very definitely the signal that we were being given in the speech that he gave this afternoon. I mean, he touched upon all of the things that I would have expected him to: his desire to deal with cost of living crisis, to rewire the British state, but I think to really try and give people more of what they want, more of the change that they feel that they were promised at that general election 2 years ago, that they feel they haven't seen delivered. And he's going to have to do that at a hell of a pace. He's only got 3 years, if indeed he sticks to what he said already about there not being an early general election. He's going to have to get on with it, because there are lots of things that he wants to deal with. And we have just seen the Prime Minister, I can talk about it now because the embargo's lifted, in the garden in Downing Street, to talk about some of those first priorities. And he's talked not just about the cost of living crisis, but about things like the social care crisis, and the fact that he wants to fix that before he leaves office, which means, as I say, he's got a hell of a lot to do.
A hell of a lot to do. That's right, isn't it? Peter, I always remember this story. I wrote about it in a book I wrote on the last election, about you having a conversation with Keir Starmer when you were working for him. And I remember it very well. I think it goes like this. You can tell us if it's exactly correct. You said something like, "What's your vision?" And Keir Starmer said, "I hate the word vision. It's not what I kind of think is the thing I need to have." And you ended up coming up with another idea, which was missions. But ultimately, was the problem for Keir Starmer that he didn't have a vision? And from what you've seen today, does Andy Burnham have a vision?
Yeah, I think it was in part. I think that was the problem. I think the other problem was he constructed the missions in opposition, but then ditched them in government. Now, I think the big thing going for Andy is he's armed with a big argument. His argument about Westminster and Whitehall controlling too much, taking too much out of the hands of people on the ground, and therefore his project, if you like, is to give agency back to people, partly through a new economic model, and partly
Which looks like what?
And partly a new politics. So if you decentralise and do it properly, he had a very good line on Friday about giving people back control. The Tories talked about it, but actually took control away.
Every single politician has talked about decentralising control. Show me, what is he actually going to do?
Well, I would say he's different. When I've talked to Andy, what I think is compelling, and this comes from Manchester, this comes from being out of Westminster for 10 years, he's a bottom-up politician, not a top-down. Now, some people may think he talks about buses too much, but his point about buses is no one in Westminster gets the importance of why having connectivity where you live really matters. And he says that's just one example of how Westminster is out of touch. And so he says if you look through the lens first of being on the ground and the issues that really matter to people, and then put power in their hands.
How would you put power in their hands?
Well, to start with, it's massive devolution. You literally take power and people and resources and give them to combined authorities and local communities, and I hope the third sector, the charity sector as well, who are expert in what's going on locally, and allow them to start. So you set the national picture, you set the goals, and then you genuinely empower people to get on with it. And that's why what he's been doing in Manchester is being very non-tribal for a politician, working across political boundaries, again, something, Neal, I know you advocate very strongly, and therefore getting things done in a new political way. Now, if he can really make that work in Downing Street, that is different. It's not the same as the last 6 prime ministers.
Gordon Brown wrote a massive piece of work on devolution, and Keir Starmer said he was going to deliver it. So it is the sort of thing that we hear repeatedly. I guess what I'm trying to get at, and Neal, let me put this to you because you've spoken to Andy a lot, is what does it look like in policy terms? What do you actually change? What are people in Manchester, but all over the country, going to see that's different, that makes Andy Burnham different to Keir Starmer?
Well, look, Peter's absolutely right. That Andy is about a different state and a different democracy, that he believes that Britain is too centralised, it's too adversarial, it's too short-term, and politics is too tribal and factional. And if he acts on that stuff, then he will change the way we do politics so that in the medium to long term, we can change our economy and our society, which is what he's practiced in Manchester. Famously, for me, he made a speech at the beginning of the year on why Manchester is the fastest growing city region in the country. And he was introduced in that by the local leader of the Liberal Democrats. Now, you can't imagine another politician in the country who will be introduced by someone from an opposing party, because he works with people consensually. He brings people in. They never have votes in Greater Manchester. They talk about it and they sort it out between them. And then you create the confidence for the state and for businesses to invest in the long term. Now, if he brings that approach
including with reform. I've noticed that he was talking about Nigel Farage being a great communicator. Are you happy for him to reach out to reform?
I think it's as long as it's broadly on the agenda that he wants to push. It's really interesting that Andy is not a tribal or personal operator. He's never really got a bad word to say about anyone. Look at the way he handled the Makerfield by-election. He did not attack the reform candidate at all. So I think that would be a welcome change to our politics, to treat people decently and kindly and respectfully. It's not the only thing that needs to happen, but it's a step in the right direction.
Let's come back to all of that. Caroline, while we're on, and obviously this will have happened for a lot of people watching and listening to us, but while we were on, the Times are suggesting Rachel Reeves was offered Defence Secretary and turned it down. Why do you think she'd be turning a role like that down? She'd be only the second female Defence Secretary after Penny Mordaunt.
I think it's really difficult for her to kind of think about the jobs that she might have taken. I understand that there were only 3 jobs that she would have considered taking, and clearly Defence Secretary is not one of them. It was rumoured and speculated that might be the case over the weekend. But it is one of those areas that would have been difficult for her to take, given, I think, that row which happened with Keir Starmer and, of course, John Healey before he resigned as Defence Secretary, when she was accused of blocking additional defence spending for the Defence Investment Plan. And it sort of smacks a little bit of this idea that, she was sort of being sent in to fix perhaps a mess that she had created, and perhaps she didn't feel very comfortable with that, given the position that she had previously taken in the Treasury.
You might think she'd take the opposite position, though, and say, OK, I gave you this much money and now I'm going to show you that it was possible.
Yeah, she could have done. I think knowing Rachel, it would have been a difficult one for her to sort of change position and tack completely on it. She was obviously, when she was looking at that Defence Investment Plan, was weighing up the government's priorities and deciding that perhaps defence wasn't the overall priority that she wanted to invest the billions of pounds that she has in her coffers. And it would have been a complete kind of reverse ferret, because she would have had to have then defended a sort of different decision only a couple of weeks, and it is weeks, after she'd made that initial decision. But also, if you think about the defence secretaries that we've had in the past, they've all had a particular kind of interest, nexus, experience. Look at Dan Jarvis at the moment and the experience that he's had personally in the armed forces. And perhaps she didn't feel that she had that connection with the subject that maybe she felt would be needed to take on that brief successfully.
And before we get to the kind of long-term questions about how Andy Burnham is promising to bring the biggest changes to society in 40 years, he's told us that he's going to give us a bit of breathing space and he's going to give us a cost of living policy tomorrow, and it's going to be funded. I'm going to ask you all to just answer this quite quickly. What do you think it should be, and what do you think it will be? And don't worry if you get it wrong, Caroline.
What do I think it will be? Well, he's just answered my question on this. I asked him about it directly a couple of hours ago and said, where would his priority be in terms of that cost of living announcement? I said to him, was it buses, was it energy bills, or was it going to be something like a rent freeze, which would obviously have a dramatic effect on the fortunes of thousands and thousands of people? And he said he was looking at all of those things, but actually hadn't quite yet made the final decision on what he was going to do. But if I was a guessing woman, I would say he'd do something on the buses, because I think it speaks to his devolution agenda. As your guests were just saying, he is very passionate about what happened in Manchester, and he feels that it made a tangible difference, given that it's really only in London and the South East where we have really fantastic public transport options. Out in Manchester and other areas of the country, buses are really, really essential to getting people into jobs and getting them around. So I would suspect that that's the one that he'll potentially land on.
Although interesting, you think he might not have made his mind up quite yet. He has got a bit of a reputation for not making up his mind very quickly. I mean, both of you, what do you think it should be? Maybe it'll be buses. I've also noticed him talking about personal allowance being brought up when he's on the ground and saying to people, actually, he's being stereotyped as a tax raiser. That might not be where he goes.
I've got a strong view on the cost of living stuff. I think politicians that try and be too transactional, we're going to cut a little bit here, you're going to vote for us, it doesn't tend to work. When I've spoken to a lot of people across the country about this, what they want is to know that they're on the up escalator, as they put it, that their life's getting better, that there's more opportunities. Then, of course, they want a bit of help with that. But if you major on that and you overclaim on that, and it's a few p here and there, then I think you get no political dividends. So I think he's got to be more strategic, being less transactional than the last government. If I were going to do it, I would do something big, or don't overclaim about it. And by big, I mean, a big tax cut for working people.
Which would be which? Which tax cut would you do?
He said in an interview, I think today, that when he was in Makerfield, the personal allowance came up a lot.
So you'd raise that?
Now, if you've actually raised that, as that's what people are telling you, and he wants to respond to that, then do something on the personal allowance that will make a real difference.
Which is very expensive. And
then you've got to say how you're going to pay for it.
And once I've heard from you, Neal, I'll be interested in asking you all about the difficult side of the coin.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that vote Labour and win a microwave I agree with Peter, that is transactional stuff, and people see through that. They don't want it. I think the personal allowance thing would be a really good move if they can fund it. It's in tune with the spirit of the man. Well, not raising allowances, is against the spirit of the manifesto. So you can say, I'm so in tune with it, I'm going to work on this properly and find the money, and people would feel that in their pay packet, obviously, very freely, very soon, and it would give them the chance to decide decide what they want to spend their extra money on. Obviously, you can pick buses or other issues, and they're very worthwhile doing, but they only impact on a certain group of people. So I think the personal allowance one would be a very strong move.
I mean, the issue obviously is how you're going to pay for something like that. And that's sort of my next question, because it feels to me, having covered politics for many years, that there isn't much appetite among the public for cuts. I mean, we've seen what happened with winter fuel allowance. I mean, I remember back in the 2012 George Osborne budget, sitting there being briefed by the Treasury, looking down the red book and saying, oh, they've done a lot here on age-related allowances. The Daily Mail political editor was sat next to me and he went, granny tax. I mean, from then to now, these are unpopular things to do. How are you going to pay for what would be a very expensive tax cut if you went there with personal allowance? Neal?
Well, Andy's already said that he's very interested in things like wealth taxes. There's a whole range of things that could be done.
You say that, but he sounds like he's been pushing away from that.
Well,
would you expect to see a wealth tax?
Look, I go back to if the test is rolling back 40 years of neoliberalism, then you've got to do something about the yawning gap between the rich and the poor, and everyone winces around that. But if you don't do that, then you are going to be throwing people into the hands of reform. Something has got to be done big now to stop the polarisation and the extremism in British politics. Closing the gap between the top and the bottom is one part of that. Whether you do it with equalising income tax and capital gains, whether you do it around land value, whether you look at the excellent work that people at universities like the LSE have done in terms of introducing a proper wealth tax. All of that would be popular. It's not easy, but I think it's absolutely essential. And then there are things like the fiscal rules. He's said he doesn't want to be in hock to the bond market. Now, you've got to be really careful about how you go about that. But he's absolutely right that all of our spending decisions shouldn't be, determined by international bond markets.
Caroline, and I'll just come back to you, Peter, on the same point. But he's been talking to yourself and other journalists about the idea of reducing bus fares, cutting energy costs, for example. Did he give you any sense of where he would find the money?
Well, the question that was asked was obviously around the kind of wealth tax issue. How are you going to fund these things? And given that he has talked about in the past looking at restoring the 50p top rate of tax, that was obviously one of the questions that we asked him, was whether he would consider it. And actually, he did fail to rule it out on two separate occasions. But of course, that would be a manifesto-breaking change if he were to do that, given that they have stated, and he has stated publicly, that he's going to stick within the red lines of the manifesto, which says no rises in income tax or VAT or indeed national insurance. So I think it is going to be problematic to stick to those confines. But clearly, he's indicated to us today that all of those things are being looked at. And of course, just in reference to your earlier point about what he could do on the personal allowance, he said very clearly that he is looking at that. But I think his feeling is that that's got to wait until the budget, because obviously it's the fiscal announcement. But we understand, and certainly sources that I was speaking to last week, and of course a lot can change in just a couple of days, is that they are eyeing up the idea of an early budget, possibly as soon as October.
And Peter, just on all of this, was it a mistake in opposition when you were working with Keir Starmer not to give yourself any wriggle room when it came to taxes, not to say we might be able to raise one of the big three? I mean, I really felt as a reporter following it at the time that you bound your hands. You did it because you were worried about not winning an election. But in doing so, you left yourself with a problem that has, in the end, probably brought down Keir Starmer to some degree.
So yes is the answer. I think it was a mistake, but it's a hard judgment. I mean, Neal and I both remember before 97, Gordon Brown said he'd stick to the Tory spending limits for 2 years. Given the size of the landslide, everyone said once we were in power, why did you need to tie your hands for 2 years? So you can overcorrect or be overly cautious in advance. And I don't hold it too much against people for doing that. But in hindsight, you can say, actually, leave a bit more.
It's not all a game in which you turn a dial here and try and get elected. It's about, for me, trust in politics. I have watched trust absolutely kind of crater in politics. I think something like 9% of people actually trust a politician to tell the truth. So the one thing we needed from a Labour or any other government coming in is for people to say they're going to do this and then do it. And the reality was that Labour knew how bad the economic situation was and couldn't respond to it without some way of raising money.
But it's very interesting for someone from the media saying that, when the media is half the problem there, which is if you say anything, particularly Labour, in opposition, it always gets crucified, and there's a history of that happening. So I don't hold it against shadow chancellors.
So you think winning was more important?
No, I'm not saying you win knowing you're going to break it and then lie. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the pressures on a Labour team to head off and reassure and not be crucified on tax and spend is very, very real. Having said that, I think we could have left more wiggle room going into the government.
This is a moment to see if politics and the culture of politics and the relations of politics can be recast. I think Andy Burnham does have some ability to do that, and we need a much more kind of adult-to-adult relationship between political leaders and the electorate. The political leaders need to be more honest and more open and more transparent, and we as voters need to grow up and understand that there are responsibilities. There's the long term. There's pain to be had. So I think for all of us, and maybe Burnham is someone who could help break that spell of kind of parent-child relationship in politics and change the nature of it and change it over the dispatch box with Kemi Badenoch, with others.
But the early mood music doesn't feel like it's going where you thought it was going to go, does it?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, you talked about wealth taxes. The soundings that we're getting from Andy sound like they're pushing away from that.
So, I mean, look, my view of where Labour's at with Andy Burnham is that they've been offered a lifeline to take them to base camp. And there is a mountain to climb of intellectual, cultural, organisational work to change our politics and change our country. People have voted in this country for big change at every election since 2016, since Brexit. And if Burnham doesn't deliver it, then you're right, that cynicism and that disbelief and that lack of trust will go through the floor. So this is the last chance saloon. And that's why I think every move that he makes on policy, on personnel, need to be radical and need to pass what he said, which was the Makerfield test. If they don't, then this will fail very early, and it won't be just Labour that's damaged by this. This is democracy, civil liberties, trust in the system, and which opens our politics up to very bad people and very bad
radical,
places.
You're talking about ideas that shift to the left. Peter, does that worry you?
No, I mean, it depends what the ideas are. Look, I think there's an appetite, certainly on the economy, to do something pretty radical because since, as Neal said, since 2008 and the economic crash, we've had stagnant wages, stagnant living standards, and people feel in large parts of the country completely screwed. And most people, I've talked to 1,000 young people for the NEAT review that Alan Milburn's doing, young people in schools, and they just don't feel they've got a future, a lot of them at the moment. So we've got to bring back hope for the next generation that they will have the opportunities and they will be able to get somewhere. And that requires radical changes to the education system as well as the economy, to the labour market, to the welfare state. All of those things need an upheaval if they are to properly give people the opportunities they need.
And Caroline, reporting right now from inside Parliament, as we can see, just on a few other points where I'm interested in whether you think he'll be radical on these. Do you think they'll consider war bonds as a way to fund defence? There's talk, in fact, you mentioned it earlier, about something really radical on social care, talk about it trying to match an NHS type system, could cost something like £18 billion. Do you think they're going to go there on something like that? Do you think he will be a radical prime minister, or do you think he will tend to move back to kind of more traditional norms?
I think it's going to be really difficult for him not to be radical, given what he said about what he's intending to do and the change that he wants to bring about. I mean, in answer to your question about war bonds, I mean, I think that he's already made comments which he's sort of moved away from about finding a different way to take borrowing off the books when it comes to defence spending, for example. And there are other options there other than war bonds. For example, the Defence Bank that's been talked about previously that Mark Carney has signed up a number of countries to is one option that I know that Andy Burnham Burnham's team are looking at. But look, I mean, I think the stuff around education it is really personal to him. It's something that he seems to be very passionate about. He does seem to be talking about a really radical shift there in terms of having a sort of parity between vocational and academic study routes. That is something that I think that the young people in this country are absolutely crying out for, she says, as a mum of three children who are all of an age where they are trying to make decisions about their future and finding it really, really difficult. So I think there are lots of ways in which he can make a difference. Whether he can find the funding to do it or the political capital to do it is an entirely different question. But I do think, having spoken to some of Andy Burnham's closest allies, including Steve Rotherham recently, they feel that so long as they make an argument for doing it and say, look, some of these things are going to be difficult, some of them are going to require difficult trade-offs, but this is the reason that we're doing it. So, for example, talking about sort of tax rises to pay for like 1 million new apprenticeships, for example, is an argument that can be made, and they want to have that kind of argument. And if they do, I think they might be knocking on an open door, because I think particularly around young people, there is a huge appetite for change.
So while we've been doing this, we know there has been a call between Andy Burnham and perhaps one of the most challenging people he's going to deal with, Donald Trump. Apparently, he invited Donald Trump to come to Manchester after the president suggested that Andy Burnham was the mayor of some town, wasn't he? I think the G20 is in Manchester next year, so it will make sense for the invitation to go out there. Just a couple of things I just wanted to finally explore on this. Number one, it's going to be tricky dealing with Donald Trump, isn't it? But also, the rise of Donald Trump tells us about the changing political landscape into which Andy Burnham is becoming Prime Minister, a landscape in which people are much more conspiratorial on average, I think. People are much more likely to get their news from echo chambers. People don't trust politicians, as we've been discussing. How does that change the type of Prime Minister he has to be, and how will he deal with Trump?
Well, look, if I was speaking to Andy today, I'd tell him to read a really short book by Anton Jaeger called Hyperpolitics. And that's the age we live in, right? Where everything feels permissible, but nothing is possible, where politics is everywhere all the time, but nothing really changes, and frustration and alienation and polarization bubble up. And it's kind of, the thing about Andy that I worry about slightly is that he looks backwards more than he looks forwards. He wants to kind of take Labour back to where it was, and that some of that is right. But actually, social democratic projects, 1945, 64, 97, are always successful when they have a very modernising agenda. So he's got to. I want to see more about the future. And does he have to handle Trump that much? Trump is unhandleable. Everyone should stop worrying about him, really. He'll do one thing this minute and he'll change the next minute or whatever.
They have pretty big effects on our economy.
Of course they do, but I'm not sure. I think he should work with, other countries, Europe, Canada, etc., to do what we can do and stop anticipating and worrying about Trump, because I think that takes you nowhere.
And I just do need to ask you, do you think he will actually drive through proportional representation?
Well, he's been really firm on this. I expect him and want him to be really firm, because it underpins all of his politics about long-term consensus building. Again, though, I worry about the people around him who are not in favour of it. So it may be a personal battle he's got to have to get it in the manifesto for the next election. But he absolutely should stick to his very solid guns on this and deliver on PR.
And Peter, this world, Neal's right, it's completely changed from the Blair years and the Brown years, hasn't it?
Yeah,
is Andy Burnham looking back? Well,
but I think Andy gets the attention economy, and that's actually something that Trump, whatever we think of Trump, he gets the attention economy. And just to give you one way you've got to do that, which is you've got to be always on in your communications. You've got to narrate the story of what you're doing. So I would expect Andy to come out of a cabinet meeting and immediately say on video, this is what I discussed, these were the problems, these are the issues, being very transparent transparent, being very honest, coming out of PMQs, saying I was floored by the first question or I would have liked a better response to the second. It's that constant brutal honesty, transparency, always narrating what you're doing. This government so far, the last 2 years, has been under-explaining why it's doing something, for what purpose, what are the benefits to people. And you've got to do that. To be fair to Trump, he gets some of that. And that's something that Andy, I think, has learned.
And finally, Caroline, what do you think? Do you think Andy Burnham is going to be different, both in substance and style, or will we be crossing paths in Downing Street in front of another leader before we know it?
I think he'll definitely be different in sort of substance and style. I mean, my knowledge of Andy Burnham personally is having worked with him on the contaminated blood campaign for many years, really battling to get justice for those victims. And that does teach you a little bit about the kind of politician that he is. You know, this was not a populist issue. This was not something that was grabbing the headlines, but it was something that he felt very deeply was an injustice. And I think that that's something that he kind of learned from his experience dealing with the Hillsborough situation as well. So I do think that is a very different way of doing politics. It's kind of, as I think some of the other guests have described it, it's kind of bottom up approach, and listening to people and the way in which politics affects their lives, and trying to deal with some of those problems at face value in a way that I think many politicians don't often do. They see it through the prism of an abacus as opposed to people's lives and a real human perspective. And I think Andy Burnham gets it in a different way, which is why I'm quite excited about how he might be able to do politics differently. But then we're often excited by new prime ministers. We're often also disappointed. So let's see.
Well, let's start hopeful. I think there was quite a lot of hope, but also some scepticism here, at least for day one. That is all we've got time for here on Fourcast. See you next time.